The third time a machine went down in the middle of a production run, I stopped panicking. Not because the money had stopped hurting. $4,700 in raw material stock was sitting in a pile of scrap at the back of my shop, and my biggest client was on the phone asking why his order was 3 days late. Again, I stopped panicking because I had started counting. 16 months. 11 failures. $67,000 in ruined material, emergency labor, and penalty fees to clients who had run out of patience with me. And every single time I called my supplier, I got the same answer. Operator error. But there was something I had not told them yet. Something sitting quietly at the bottom of a manila folder I had started carrying to every phone call. A 4-page document I had received on a Tuesday morning that changed everything about how that conversation was going to go. To understand what was on page 4, you need to understand who my supplier was and exactly why I almost believed them. By the end of this story, you will understand how a single metallurgical test report dismantled 2 years of carefully constructed blame. You will see how one small business owner, dismissed as incompetent by the company paid to supply her, rebuilt everything she had lost, not with anger, but with documentation. And you will understand why the most dangerous thing a dishonest supplier can do is blame the person they are cheating. Because that person tends to start building a folder. I had run my shop for 7 years before any of this started. It was not a glamorous business. We machined precision aluminum components for industrial clients' conveyor brackets, mounting fixtures, custom fasteners. The work required patience, attention to the 1/10 of a millimeter, and people who showed up on time and cared about what they were making. I had 4 of those people. I had a good reputation for clean work and realistic timelines. I had built it from a single-used CNC machine in a rented unit, and every year it had grown a little more. Those 2 things, honesty about what I could deliver and consistency when I delivered it, were the only real advantages a shop my size had over larger competitors. They were not glamorous advantages, but they were real ones. My supplier came to me through a referral. I had been sourcing carbide cutting tool inserts from a regional distributor for years, and when that distributor was bought out by a larger company in early 2021, a contact in my industry passed me a name, a specialty manufacturer with a reputation for precision-grade tooling at competitive pricing. Their sales representative came to my shop in person. He brought sample inserts. He knew the ISO specifications for the grades I needed without being coached on them. He spoke the language of precision machining feed rates, interrupted cuts, hardness tolerances, the way someone speaks a language they actually know. He seemed to understand exactly what my operation required. The first 2 orders came in on schedule and ran clean. Inserts arrived correctly labeled, passed my incoming inspection, and performed through their expected life cycle without issue. I moved more of my monthly volume to them. By the 3rd month, they were my primary source for the grades I used most. And then, the failures started. The first came on a Wednesday afternoon. A carbide insert fractured mid-run on a batch of aluminum mounting plates. Fractures happen. I documented it, submitted a warranty claim, and received a replacement shipment, and a note explaining that the failure was likely caused by incorrect spindle speed. I checked my settings. They were correct. I adjusted nothing, because nothing needed adjusting. I moved on. 6 weeks later, it happened again. Different machine, different material, same result of fracture at a point in the cut cycle that should have posed no unusual stress on the tooling. Another call. Another explanation. My operator was running the material too aggressively. My operator had 14 years of machining experience. But I said nothing. I ran a verification test on the settings and filed the results. I moved on. The third failure cost me a client order and the beginning of my reputation with them. That was when I opened a new folder on my desk. I started logging every incident: date, machine, insert batch number, material stock, operating settings at time of failure, the explanation I received, whether a replacement was offered or refused. I had not shown anyone that folder yet, but I was no longer simply moving on. By autumn of that year, I had 11 documented failures. Each one had been returned to me with a different explanation: spindle speed, feed rate, coolant flow, operator technique, tool holder runout. The answers rotated. The direction never changed. Every failure originated on my end. The inserts had performed correctly. The problem was always something I had done. I want to be precise about what this cost me professionally, because it matters for what comes next. In precision manufacturing, a client does not forget a missed deadline. They calculate it. They add it to a column. My largest account, a regional conveyor systems manufacturer I had served for 4 years, issued a formal notice period after my third consecutive failed delivery window. 2 more missed deadlines within 6 months, and they would move their volume to another shop. That contract represented $38,000 in annual revenue. A second client had already moved on without explanation. I found out through a mutual contact. I called my supplier again. I reached the sales representative, I will call him Derek, and told him I had now documented 11 failures across 16 months, and that the explanations I had received were not consistent with the operating conditions in my shop. He listened. Then he said, in the tone of someone who has said this many times, that precision tooling failure in a production environment is a complex diagnosis, and that in his experience, the most common root cause was something in the setup rather than the insert itself. I thanked him. I hung up. And then I did something I had not done before. I pulled the batch numbers from all 11 failed inserts and looked for a pattern. 3 batch codes. Out of 17 I had purchased in 16 months, 3 codes accounted for every single documented failure. The inserts that had performed correctly came from 14 different batches. The inserts that fractured all traced back to those same 3. That pattern had no explanation in spindle speed. I reached out to a former colleague who now worked in materials testing. I described what I was seeing. She asked me one question. Had I had the failed inserts independently tested? I had not. She explained that carbide inserts sold to a specific ISO grade carry published hardness and composition tolerances. Those tolerances are not recommendations. They are the standard the product is sold against. An insert that tests below minimum hardness will fracture under loads it should sustain, and to anyone who does not run a laboratory analysis, the fracture will look like exactly what Derek had been telling me it was. I went back to my folder. I had started retaining failed insert samples after the third incident, not because I had a plan, just because something told me to keep them. I had 12 samples across the 3 failed batches, each in a labeled bag with the batch number and date of failure written in marker. But here is the third thing, and this is the one that stopped me cold. 4 months earlier, Derek had left a printed internal delivery invoice on my workbench after a visit. I had filed it without reading it carefully. When I finally looked the ISO grade printed on his internal fulfillment paperwork did not match the ISO grade listed on my purchase orders. The gap between those 2 grades was not a rounding error. It was the difference between a cutting insert rated for high-stress interrupted cuts and one rated for light finishing passes on soft material. I had been purchasing one. I had been receiving the other, and Derek had signed his name to every delivery confirmation. I sat at my desk for a long time after that. I want to be honest about what I seriously considered doing at this point. Walking away had a practical shape to it. I had a folder of documented failures and 1 suspicious invoice. When I described the situation to my attorney over the phone, she told me that supplier disputes involving component quality were hard to win. Proving causation, she said, was the expensive part. Her estimate for legal costs before any outcome was guaranteed: $15,000. I had spent 2 years losing money. I did not have $15,000 to gamble on a theory. My production manager, who had been with me since the beginning, and who had watched me manage these failures from the inside, came to my office one afternoon in November and said what she had clearly been holding back for months. She sat across from my desk, set her hands flat on the table, and told me that sometimes the cost of the fight is higher than just changing suppliers and continuing forward. She said it plainly, because she is a plain-spoken person, and she said it because she was trying to protect her own job, which was a rational thing to do. I could not fault her for saying it. She was not wrong. She was just looking at 1 column of numbers. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time. I thought about the 7 years I had put into building a shop with a reputation so clean that clients referred other clients. I thought about what it had felt like to quote a delivery date with complete confidence. And I thought about how I had not felt that confidence in 16 months because a supplier had been shipping me components that could not survive the application they were sold for, and then blaming me, in writing, every single time one failed. That was not a delivery problem. That was a decision someone had made. I went inside, came back out from my folder, and brought it to the kitchen table. My spouse sat down with me without being asked. She did not offer advice. She did not tell me what to do. She just sat there, and that was the thing I needed more than I could have articulated. I opened the folder. I went through every incident log, every explanation, every invoice. I looked at the delivery paperwork with the mismatched grade numbers, and I started a different kind of list, not what I had lost, what I could still prove. And then I did something nobody had told me to do. I called my contact at the materials testing firm the next morning. She walked me through what an independent analysis would involve. An accredited metallurgical laboratory could perform a Rockwell hardness test and a full compositional analysis on my retained samples. The test would measure whether the carbide material met the published tolerances for the ISO grade listed on my purchase orders. If the material fell outside those tolerances, the result would be documented in a formal laboratory report stamped with the lab's accreditation number, and that report would be admissible as evidence in a legal proceeding. The cost was $2,400. I scheduled it the same day. I packaged 12 samples from each of the 3 failed batches with their original batch labels intact and shipped them the following morning. I received a receipt confirmation 4 days later. Turnaround was approximately 3 weeks. I used those 3 weeks to complete everything else in the folder. I cross-referenced every purchase order against Derek's internal delivery notes. Item by item, batch by batch. I documented every instance where the ISO grade on my order did not match the grade on his fulfillment paperwork. I compiled every written communication in which Derek had attributed a failure to my operation and printed every email I had sent in response, documenting the corrective actions I had taken, adjustments to settings that had been correct from the beginning. I kept returning to one name in my research. The accrediting body listed at the bottom of the ISO specifications, the inserts were sold against the organization that maintained the published standards my supplier had represented their product as meeting. I had not contacted them yet, but I had printed their published tolerances for the grade in question and set them at the top of my folder. I waited. 22 days after I shipped the samples, the laboratory report arrived in my inbox at 6:47 in the morning. I printed all 4 pages. I sat down at my desk. I read through page 1, page 2, page 3. Page 4 was the conclusion. I called my attorney. Every sample from all 3 failed batches tested below the minimum Rockwell hardness specified for the ISO grade on my purchase orders. Not marginally below. An average of 11 points below the published minimum across all 12 samples, across all 3 batches. The lab's conclusion, stated in careful technical language, was that the deviation was significant and consistent. Consistent, meaning it did not appear by accident. Consistent, meaning it reflected how those batches were manufactured, not how they were used. My attorney read the report the same afternoon I sent it. She called back within the hour. The word she used was liability. The grade mismatch in the delivery paperwork, she said. Combined with a lab report showing the product did not meet the grade it was sold as, that is not a gray area. That is a documented breach of express warranty. We filed a civil complaint 6 weeks later. The complaint rested on 2 claims. First, breach of express warranty. My purchase orders had specified an ISO grade. The supplier had represented the product as meeting that grade. An independent laboratory testing proved it did not. Second, negligent misrepresentation. The discrepancy between the grade on my purchase orders and the grade on Derek's internal fulfillment paperwork established that the supplier had been shipping product it knew or should have known did not match the contracted specification. As supporting exhibits, We submitted the published ISO standards from the accrediting body I had been researching for 3 weeks. Those documents established exactly what my purchase orders had promised me, and exactly how far the delivered product had fallen short. We also sought consequential damages for the 2 client contracts I had lost. My original purchase agreement contained a clause 1 I had signed and largely forgotten that explicitly acknowledged the inserts would be used in precision manufacturing applications where tooling failure would produce downstream commercial losses. That clause was the reason the consequential damages argument was viable. The supplier's legal team requested the laboratory's full chain of custody documentation. They received it within the week. They requested the sample identification numbers for all 12 tested inserts. They received those too. And then, during discovery, they made the request that changed the tone of the entire proceeding. They asked whether I had retained any additional samples beyond the 12 submitted to the laboratory. I had 4 more. In a labeled bag. In the bottom drawer of my desk. The investigator their legal team sent to my shop spent 40 minutes not looking at my machines. She spent it looking at my records, my incident logs, my settings documentation, the corrective action memos I had written to myself after every failure, each one dated, each one filed. She made a note on her clipboard and said, quietly, almost to herself, "These records are very complete." I said nothing. By then I had learned that in a legal proceeding, silence is not empty. It means everything relevant has already been said, in writing, with a date on it. And then came the part I did not expect. During discovery, the supplier's own internal quality audit records were subpoenaed. Those records showed that the 3 batch codes I had documented the 3 codes behind every single one of my 11 failures appeared in an internal non-conformance review conducted 8 months before my first reported incident. The supplier's own quality team had flagged those batches as falling outside hardness tolerances. They had flagged them. And then they had shipped them anyway. During discovery, a second detail emerged that I had not been looking for. The subpoenaed quality records showed that 14 months before my first failure, a precision machining shop in Ohio, I will call the owner Sandra, had submitted 8 formal defect complaints about the same 3 batch codes and threatened to pursue legal action. Sandra had been offered a credit toward future purchases and a formal apology letter. She had accepted the credit. The non-conforming batches had stayed in the shipping pipeline. Sandra's losses were documented in the supplier's own files at $41,000. She had received a credit for $3,200 in replacement product. Her folder had not been built the way mine was. That was the only difference. Settlement came 14 months after I mailed those 12 samples to the laboratory. I recovered $94,000, direct material losses, emergency labor, client penalty fees, the 2 lost contracts, and attorney fees. As a term of the agreement, the 3 non-conforming batch codes were formally logged in the supplier's quality management system, and the supplier was required to implement third-party batch verification for all precision-grade tooling going forward. I notified my largest client that I had identified the source of every failure and resolved it through independent testing. I did not share the number. They did not ask for it. 6 months later, they increased their monthly volume with my shop by 20%. $94,000 sounds like a clean ending. It is not a clean ending. 2 years of supplier failures cost me more than money. They cost me a kind of confidence that takes a long time to rebuild, the kind where you quote a delivery timeline to a client and you mean it completely, without a small hesitation somewhere in the back of your mind. That hesitation does not disappear the day a settlement check arrives. It disappears slowly, one delivered order at a time. Justice does not restore. I want to be precise about that. What justice does is stop a pattern. It closes a door that would otherwise stay open. My attorney told me, after the case settled, that the supplier had received 4 informal complaints about precision tooling failures in the 12 months before my first incident. None of those complaints went anywhere. They were logged, absorbed with technical explanations, and quietly closed. My complaint was not the first, but my folder was different from what came before it, because I had kept every sample, tracked every batch number, and documented every explanation in writing on the day I received it, before I knew whether any of it would matter. Documentation is not a personality type. It is a decision made before the reason becomes obvious. The people in my shop thought I was spending time I did not have on records that might never be relevant. Every single one of those records was submitted as a legal exhibit. Here is what I know now. The people who got away with it before me did not get away with it because they were smarter, or because the law protected them, or because I was wrong and they were right. They got away with it because nobody had built a folder careful enough to survive a subpoena. Mine did. 22 months after the first failure. But on my own terms. 8 months after the settlement closed, a message came through a small business manufacturing forum I had posted in during the early stages of the case. The person who sent it ran a precision sheet metal operation in a different state. 14 months of tooling failures, different product type, different supplier, but the same structure, a new technical explanation every time, rotating through every variable except the one that actually mattered. Always their fault, never the inserts. They had not tested anything yet. They asked one question: what had I tracked, and when had I started? I wrote back the same evening. I told them to begin with the batch numbers, cross-reference them against the supplier's internal shipment records, retain every failed sample with the batch code and date written on the bag before you file it. 2 weeks later, they sent a list of batch codes and an invoice with the supplier's name at the top. When I looked at the ISO grade listed on the product specification sheet they had attached, I recognized the work. If something in this story matches something you have been living, leave it in the comments. You may already be one piece of someone else's folder.